In the days when silver was weighed in scales and grain was counted in measures, there lived a household where abundance flowed, yet nothing was claimed. The steward of this house would rise each morning to survey lands that stretched beyond the horizon, fields heavy with barley and wheat, storehouses filled with oil and wine. His hands would count the silver pieces, arrange the vessels of gold, and distribute the daily portion to those under his care. Yet, in all his counting and arranging, in all his careful management of these riches, never once did he speak of them as his own. The silver passed through his fingers like water through cupped hands. The land yielded its harvest season after season, but the earth itself remained beyond human claiming. The storehouses overflowed with grain, but each measure was held in trust for another season, another purpose, another mouth to feed. This was the way of provision in those ancient times, when wealth moved like the wind, present and powerful, yet never captured or contained by mortal grasp. This household was not unique in its abundance. Throughout the valleys and hills of that region, other stewards managed other treasures. They tended vineyards that produced the finest wine, supervised workshops where skilled craftsmen shaped bronze and iron, oversaw caravans that carried precious goods across distant trade routes. Each steward handled wealth that could purchase cities, yet none called themselves wealthy. Each managed treasures that kings would envy, yet none claimed ownership of what they touched daily. The pattern was established long before memory could reach. Silver flowed to those who counted it carefully but held it lightly. Land produced for those who worked it faithfully but never claimed its title. Goods multiplied in the hands of those who distributed them wisely but took no permanent possession. The abundance was real, the responsibility was heavy, but ownership remained elsewhere, held by hands they could not see, governed by purposes they were not required to understand. Years would pass in this manner. The steward would wake to abundance, work through the day managing wealth beyond measure, and sleep knowing that tomorrow the silver would again need counting, the land would again need tending, the storehouses would again need ordering. There was no ceremony of ownership, no moment when the wealth transferred from trust to possession. The pattern simply continued, day after day, season after season, generation after generation. But boundaries exist in all things, even when they cannot be seen. Like the banks of a river that guide water in its course, like the walls of a house that define its rooms, there existed around this wealth an invisible limit. The silver could be counted and used, but never claimed. The land could be worked and its harvest enjoyed, but never possessed. The goods could be managed and distributed, but never owned outright. This boundary was not marked by stone or written in scrolls. It was not declared by voice or enforced by guard, yet it held with the strength of mountains and the certainty of seasons. The steward felt this boundary without naming it. In quiet moments between his duties, when the day's work was done and the silver was safely stored, he would sense something beyond his understanding. Not fear, for the provision was generous and the work was good. Not doubt, for the abundance continued without fail. But awareness, subtle and constant, that the wealth in his care existed within limits he could not alter, under authority he could not challenge, for purposes he was not required to know. Other stewards in distant places felt this same awareness. They would speak of it sometimes when trade brought them together, not in words of complaint or confusion, but in the quiet recognition that their role was to manage, not to possess. They understood without teaching that wealth held too tightly would slip away, that abundance claimed too boldly would vanish, that provision taken for granted would cease to flow. This understanding lived in their bones like the knowledge of seasons, like the rhythm of harvest and planting, like the certainty that morning follows night. They did not question it or resist it. They simply worked within it, managing wealth that belonged to another, handling treasures that were theirs to steward but never to claim. In one household, however, this understanding began to fade. The steward there had managed abundance for many years, had seen the silver multiply under his care, had watched the land yield increase season after season. The wealth had grown so familiar to his hands that he began to forget its true nature. The silver felt like his silver as he counted it each morning. The land seemed like his land as he walked its boundaries each day. The goods appeared like his goods as he arranged them in the storehouses each evening. This shift was gradual, like the changing of seasons or the erosion of stone by water. No single day marked the moment when stewardship became ownership in his mind. No specific act declared his claim to what he managed. The change happened in small degrees, in quiet assumptions, in the slow replacement of trust with possession. The steward began to count the silver with greater frequency, not to ensure its proper use, but to confirm its amount. He would walk the land not to oversee its care, but to measure its extent. He would survey the storehouses not to distribute their contents, but to calculate their value. The wealth remained the same, but his relationship to it had altered. Where once he had seen trust, he now saw possession. Where once he had felt responsibility, he now felt ownership. With this shift came new behaviors. The silver was counted more often but distributed more reluctantly. The land was measured more carefully but worked less thoughtfully. The goods were valued more precisely but shared less freely. Fear entered where confidence had lived, for what is possessed can be lost, and what is owned can be taken. The steward who had once managed wealth with steady hands now watched it with anxious eyes. The abundance continued for a time, but something had changed in its flow. Where once the silver had multiplied naturally, now it seemed to require greater effort to maintain. Where once the land had yielded freely, now its harvest demanded more intensive care. Where once the goods had moved smoothly through trade and distribution, now obstacles appeared in their path. Still the steward worked, but his work had taken on a different quality. Where once he had acted from trust, he now acted from worry. Where once he had distributed from abundance, he now hoarded from fear. Where once he had planned from confidence, he now calculated from anxiety. The wealth was still present, but its nature had changed in his hands. What had once felt like a river now felt like a reservoir, contained and controlled rather than flowing and free. The invisible boundary, patient and constant, began to assert itself. Not through dramatic intervention or sudden judgment, but through the quiet withdrawal of what had been freely given. The silver still filled the counting tables each morning, but its increase slowed. The land still produced its harvest each season, but the yield decreased. The goods still moved through trade routes, but their profits diminished. These changes came gradually, like the turning of a great wheel or the shifting of a massive stone. The steward noticed them but attributed them to natural cycles, to temporary difficulties, to challenges that effort and planning could overcome. He counted the silver more often, worked the land more intensively, managed the goods more carefully. Yet the abundance continued its quiet retreat. Seasons passed in this manner. The steward applied himself with greater dedication, employed more workers, implemented new systems of management. He studied the patterns of trade, analyzed the cycles of harvest, consulted with other stewards about their methods. Yet despite all his efforts, the wealth in his care continued its gradual decline. The silver that had once multiplied now remained steady, then began to diminish. The land that had once yielded abundance now produced adequacy, then moved toward scarcity. The goods that had once flowed freely now moved with difficulty, encountering obstacles and delays that had never existed before. In quiet moments when the day's anxious work was done and he sat alone with his concerns, the steward would remember earlier times. He would recall the ease with which abundance had flowed, the confidence with which he had managed wealth, the peace with which he had approached each day's responsibilities. But these memories seemed distant now, like dreams from another life or stories from ancient times. The realization came not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow dawning, like sunrise over distant hills or the gradual appearance of stars in twilight sky. Sitting in his chamber one evening, surrounded by ledgers that recorded declining wealth and plans that promised uncertain outcomes, the steward understood what had occurred. The silver had never been his to claim, yet he had claimed it. The land had never been his to possess, yet he had possessed it. The goods had never been his to own, yet he had owned them. And in that claiming, that possessing, that owning, he had severed the connection that allowed abundance to flow. The wealth remained in his hands, but its source had withdrawn. The responsibility continued, but the trust had been broken. This understanding brought neither despair nor anger, but a quiet recognition of pattern and consequence. Like water that ceases to flow when its channel is blocked, like plants that wither when their roots are severed from soil, abundance had simply followed its nature. It remained where trust was maintained and departed where ownership was claimed. In another region, far from this declining household, lived a steward who had observed these patterns with careful attention. He had seen wealth flow and withdraw, had watched abundance appear and disappear, had noticed the subtle relationship between trust and increase. From these observations, he had learned to hold wealth as water is held in cupped hands, present and useful, but never possessed. This steward's approach was neither complex nor mysterious. Each morning he would count the silver as one counts the stars, with appreciation but without claim. He would survey the land as one surveys the horizon, with attention but without ownership. He would manage the goods as one manages the wind, directing their flow but never capturing their essence. Under his stewardship, abundance moved with natural ease. Silver multiplied not through grasping, but through faithful management. Land yielded not through claiming, but through careful tending. Goods flowed not through hoarding, but through wise distribution. The wealth grew because it was trusted, increased because it was stewarded, multiplied because it was never claimed. Seasons turned and years passed. Other stewards would visit this household and wonder at its prosperity. They would examine the methods, study the systems, analyze the practices that produced such abundant results. Yet the secret was not in the methods, but in the relationship, not in the systems, but in the understanding that wealth flows to those who hold it as trust, not as possession. The prosperous steward would speak little of his approach. When questioned, he would describe his daily practices, his methods of counting and distribution, his systems of management and care. But the deeper understanding lived beyond words, in the quiet recognition that abundance has its own nature, its own purposes, its own destinations. His role was simply to provide a clear channel for its flow. This household became known throughout the region for its prosperity, but also for its generosity. The abundance that flowed through the steward's hands was not contained but shared, not hoarded but distributed. Travelers found welcome there, workers found fair payment, merchants found honest dealing. The wealth moved through the household like a river through fertile land, nourishing everything it touched while continuing on its course. Years accumulated like rings in the trunk of an ancient tree. The steward aged and his hair grew white, but his hands remained steady on the scales of silver. His eyes remained clear in surveying the land. His judgment remained sound in managing the goods. The abundance that had flowed through his stewardship for decades continued without diminishment, passed from his hands to others who understood its true nature. In distant places, the stories of these two households were remembered and retold, not as lessons to be learned or principles to be applied, but as chronicles of how wealth moves in the world, how abundance flows and withdraws, how trust and possession create different relationships with the silver and gold that pass through human hands. The steward who had claimed ownership continued his work under increasing difficulty. The wealth in his care dwindled to adequacy, then to scarcity. Yet even as abundance withdrew, understanding could still return. The patterns that governed wealth were not vindictive but natural, not punitive but corrective. Trust could be rebuilt, stewardship could be restored. The relationship between human hands and divine provision could be mended. In the end, both households joined the long chronicle of how wealth behaves in human hands. Some learned to hold abundance as trust and saw it multiply. Others grasped it as possession and watched it withdraw. The silver continued to move, the land continued to yield, the goods continued to flow. But their destinations were determined by the nature of the hands that received them, the hearts that stewarded them, the minds that understood their true source. The seasons continued their ancient rhythm. Morning followed night, harvest followed planting, abundance followed trust. In counting houses throughout the land, stewards weighed silver and made their choices. Some chose ownership and watched wealth withdraw. Others chose trust and saw abundance flow. The patterns remained constant, written not in laws, but in the nature of provision itself. These are the chronicles of wealth, not as men desire it, but as it is entrusted.